Over the last couple of days, Silver Palace just kept showing up everywhere for me. Another trailer on YouTube, another clip on X, another discussion about this new open world gacha that somehow I hadn't really paid much attention to before. Eventually, I gave in. I sat down, looked through everything we actually know about the game, and tried to answer a pretty simple question. Why are so many people excited about Silver Palace already? Because on the surface, the answer feels obvious. It has a beautiful Victorian-inspired world, it has flashy combat, it has great character designs. None of that is exactly rare anymore. But after a while, those stopped being the interesting parts. Instead, one idea kept coming back. Everything about Silver Palace feels like it's pointing toward the same kind of story. The world, the mystery, even the decision to make the protagonist a detective. For a game we still know surprisingly little about, it already has one of the clearest storytelling identities I've seen from an upcoming open world gacha. Now, whether it can actually live up to that promise, that's a completely different question, and I think that's the part that's really worth talking about. So I started with the city. Silvernia has presence. It doesn't look like another fantasy capital that just happens to have Victorian buildings. Everything is built around the same idea. The architecture, the factories, the streets, the way magic and machinery exist side by side. Even Silverium, the resource the city was built around, does more than explain why the civilization became so advanced. It explains why everyone would want control over it. The buildings eventually became the least interesting part of Silvernia. A city driven by industry, powered by a resource valuable enough to shape its entire future. A place where wealth, influence, and political power naturally gather in the same streets. Silver Palace isn't really borrowing a country, it's borrowing an era. And that's a much more interesting foundation. Because an era brings its own problems. Industrialization creates opportunities. Opportunity creates inequality. Inequality creates ambition. Ambition creates corruption. And corruption creates stories. That's why detective fiction feels so natural in a world like this. Cities built on rapid change naturally produce secrets. The world itself starts generating conflict before the writers even introduce a single character. Then, Silver Palace adds something I honestly wasn't expecting. Magic. Not subtle magic, not the kind that quietly sits in the background. This is a world with enormous creatures, supernatural abilities, and powers that clearly push it much closer to high fantasy than historical fiction. A grounded detective story usually relies on logic. High fantasy loves making the impossible possible. Instead, Silver Palace seems to be asking a much more interesting question. What happens when a civilization goes through its own industrial revolution? Except, magic evolves alongside it. Crime changes, technology changes, politics change, even the kinds of mystery people can write start changing. That's the biggest reason this world has stayed in my head. It feels coherent. Every major idea we've seen so far keeps reinforcing the same identity instead of pulling in different directions. At that point, I couldn't imagine the protagonist being anything else. Of course, the protagonist is a detective. I honestly can't think of another role that fits this world better. Before Silver Palace had even introduced its first real case, I was already trying to answer 5 different questions. I wasn't trying to figure out who the protagonist was, I was trying to figure out what had happened. The detective returns to Silvernia after disappearing for 3 years. Around the same time, the city went through one of its biggest political moments with Queen Feliana's coronation. Those two events happen on the same timeline. Maybe that's a coincidence. I doubt it. Then there's the murder investigation that brings the detective back in the first place. Suddenly, before the story has finally begun, my head is already full of questions. Where were they for 3 years? Why leave? Why come back now? Is the murder connected to their disappearance? Is any of this connected to the coronation? Those are the questions that hooked me. I already had enough information to start building theories. Not to mention, none of those questions are really about the protagonist. They're all about the city. That's where Silver Palace has a chance to separate itself from a lot of other gacha stories. Think about how most gacha stories introduce their mysteries. The protagonist doesn't know what's going on, we don't know what's going on either, so every answer arrives whenever the story decides it's time. I've never been a huge fan of that approach. Half of the fun of a mystery is trying to solve it yourself. The mystery isn't who am I, it's what happened. Also why I got so excited when I realized the protagonist wasn't another amnesic hero. Honestly, I've always felt amnesia has become one of the biggest storytelling shortcuts in gacha games. The protagonist doesn't know anything, which means the writers can explain the world one piece at a time. Suddenly, every explanation becomes a mystery. It works, but it's also predictable. Silver Palace doesn't need that. It already has a mystery worth following. The detective already has a past. They already know this city. They already have history here. The unknown isn't hiding inside the protagonist. It's hiding inside everyone else. And that's exactly what I want from a detective story. I don't want to spend dozens of hours discovering who the main character used to be. I want to discover why this city became the way it is. Who is lying? Who's manipulating events? Who's guilty? Who's only pretending to be innocent? That's where detective stories become fun. The audience isn't waiting for the writer to hand them the next answer. They're constantly trying to stay one step ahead of the detective. If Silver Palace really commits to that philosophy, I honestly think it could tell a kind of mystery that we haven't really seen from an open world gacha before. This is where my excitement becomes a little more cautious. Silver Palace has a strong identity right now. The world is clear, the protagonist's role is clear, the kind of mystery it wants to build is clear. Everything we have seen so far points in the same direction. That is rare, and it is also fragile. Because the hardest part for a live service gacha is not creating a strong identity at launch, it is protecting that identity 2 years later. That is what I'm most curious about with Silver Palace. Does it keep digging deeper into Silvernia? Does the city keep opening up through new cases, new districts, new factions, and new secrets? Or does it eventually follow the more familiar open world gacha structure, where every major update sends us somewhere completely different with a new aesthetic, a new culture, and a new direction? Personally, I hope it doubles down. A world like this does not need to become wider immediately, it needs to become deeper. That is especially true because mystery and open world can either work beautifully together or quietly get in each other's way. If Silver Palace uses the open world to make the city feel alive, that could be amazing. A district could hide evidence, a side quest could reveal something about a larger case. A building you passed 20 hours ago could suddenly become important because now you understand what happened there. That is the kind of environmental storytelling that could make the detective fantasy feel real. But there is a danger too. If the mystery becomes too dependent on complicated investigation mechanics, hidden object puzzles, or detective minigames, the game might start narrowing its own audience. Some players will love that, but not everyone comes to an open world gacha because they want a full detective simulator. So I think the best version of Silver Palace is not necessarily the version with the most complex detective gameplay. It is the version where the mystery lives mainly inside the story, the world, and the characters. The gameplay should support that mystery. It should make us feel like detectives, but it should not become so mechanically specific that the game stops feeling approachable. And the same problem exists with magic. Silver Palace clearly is not a grounded detective story. This is a high magic world. We have giant creatures, supernatural abilities, strange powers, and a city where magic seems deeply tied to civilization itself. That makes the world more exciting, but it also creates a writing challenge. Mystery stories need rules. Even magical mysteries need rules. If magic can do anything, then evidence stops mattering, logic stops mattering. A murder can be explained by whatever power the writers introduce 5 minutes before the reveal, and at that point, the mystery does not feel clever, it feels cheap. So the magic system has to be impressive without becoming an escape button. The story can have impossible crimes, it can have supernatural suspects, it can have cases that could never happen in a normal detective story. That is part of the appeal. But once the mystery begins, the audience still needs to feel like the answer was possible to understand. Not obvious, not easy, just fair. That balance is probably one of the biggest things Silver Palace has to get right. The game has to be magical enough to feel unique, but disciplined enough for the detective story to still work. And honestly, that might be the real test. Not whether Silver Palace can build a beautiful world, it already did that. Not whether it can make people curious, it already did that too. The real question is whether it can protect the thing that made it interesting in the first place. Can it stay focused? Can it keep its mysteries grounded in clues, characters, motives, and consequences? Can it avoid turning every answer into another cosmic lore reveal? because that is another danger with live service stories. The longer they go, the more they tend to escalate. The threat gets bigger, the enemy gets bigger, the lore gets bigger, and eventually the story that started with a murder mystery becomes another battle against some ancient world-ending force. That is not automatically bad, but it would be a very different game. What excites me about Silver Palace right now is not that it looks like the biggest gacha coming out, it is that it looks like one of the most specific. A Victorian-inspired city, a detective protagonist, a mystery built around a disappearance, a murder, a coronation, and a city full of secrets. That is a strong foundation. Now the developers have to decide what kind of game they actually want this to become. Do they protect that identity, or do they slowly turn it into something safer? I do not know yet, and that is why I'm trying to keep my expectations under control. We have all seen games with incredible trailers and amazing ideas struggle once players finally get their hands on them. Potential is easy to show, execution is the hard part. But if Silver Palace commits to the promise it is making right now, if the world stays focused, the mysteries feel fair, the magic has rules, and the detective fantasy remains more than just a costume, then this could become one of the most distinctive stories in the gacha space. And now we just have to see if it follows through. What about you? Are you as excited for Silver Palace as I am? Do you think Silver Palace should double down on this detective identity, or would you rather see it evolve into something broader over time? Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more story discussions like this one. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.